University in Nampa is a former state senator with a background in the tech industry. Cristina McNeil is a businesswoman and chair of the Idaho Democratic Party Latino caucus. Now from center stage at the Brandt Center, the two will square off on the issues. Who will earn your vote? This is the debate for U.S. Representative District 1.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us for tonight's important District 1 congressional candidate debate. So glad that you've joined us this evening. District 1 covers a lot of territory in Idaho, northern and western Idaho, all the way south to Owyhee County. It includes parts of Ada County, that stretches into Meridian, Eagle, and parts of Boise. And so it's a lot of ground that these two candidates have been covering as they've been campaigning. They're going to introduce themselves to you in just a moment tonight, but first, a reminder that our goal this evening is to give the candidates equal time, but at the same time to encourage a lot of interaction and exchange of ideas. We'll be keeping track of their time during this free-flowing discussion, and we'll be asking the candidates as well to stay on topic. Now, our panelists are KTVB journalists Mark Johnson and Joe Paris, and Ruth Brown from the Idaho Statesman. And KTVB producer Danny Alsop is going to be helping the candidates stay and keep track of the time that they have been talking to all of you there. So thank you everybody for joining us this evening. We do have to extend a big thank you to Northwest Nazarene University and their hospitality for allowing us to hold tonight's debate here at the beautiful Brandt Center in Nampa. Well, now it is time for our candidates to introduce themselves. You each have 1 minute to do that. And we did a coin flip right before we went to air. And so, Ms. McNeil, you will be starting with your opening statement first.
To KTVB, thank you for the opportunity to debate. Mr. Fulcher, thank you for engaging this evening. And panelists, I'm ready for your questions. To viewers, I want to lay out why I am the better choice to represent you in Washington. And running so Idaho will have a person in Congress who will represent the people. This Congress is gridlocked: healthcare, prescription drug costs, infrastructure, affordable education, and immigration. I seek common ground for common sense solutions. I will work across the aisle, across the state, and confront unfinished work America needs. Alone, all any of us have are ideas. Together, we will find solutions. People want action. America needs an economy that works for the middle class. We must not let this opportunity slip into more gridlock. I'm Cristina McNeil, and I ask for your vote on November 6th. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McNeil. And now, Mr. Fulcher.
Dee, thank you. KTVB, thank you for hosting this. And to my opponent, thank you for being here. I'm Russ Fulcher. I'm blessed to have a long family history in Idaho. The first 20 years of my life were spent on a dairy farm, and the next 20 years were spent traveling around the world for technology companies. From there, it was 10 years in the Idaho Senate while operating a real estate business. I'm running for Congress because too often I think our government leaders have forgotten that they exist to serve the people and not the other way around, and that we need to shift control to the people from government. And I want to use my experience for you. I want to help put a plan in place to improve the immigration system and the healthcare system and make it more affordable and accessible, to empower wise land management, and also, and perhaps most pertinently right now, maybe add just a little bit of civility to Washington, D.C. I'll stand for what's important to you. I have the record to prove it. Thank you.
Thank you both. All right, let's start with a question that, and I'll begin with you, Mr. Fulcher. You've served, as you mentioned, 5 terms as a state senator, and you've put your hat in the ring for governor twice, making a strong showing against Governor Otter back in 2014 during the primary, and then campaigning for 9 months in the current race for governor before pulling out when the current holder of this seat, Congressman Raul Labrador, decided to jump into the governor's race. You know, debates are often somewhat of a job interview, and so with that in mind, let me ask you this. Do you really want to be a congressman, or is this just the best political opportunity at the time and maybe a second choice?
This is as long as there's a 2-year mutual re-up clause, and those hiring me give me the option as well on that 2 years. This is exactly where I'd like to be right now. I think this is an incredibly exciting time in history. We've got a president that's open to new ideas. We've got probably the largest influx of new congressional members in maybe 50 years. And there's a window of opportunity, I think, where we really can have some positive change that would help the state of Idaho. So I'm exactly where I want to be, and this has worked out very good.
Contentious times in Washington, D.C. You said exciting, but also very challenging, I'm sure.
That's what makes it fun.
All right. Well, let me ask it to you, Ms. McNeil, this way.
Sure.
Running for Congress is an ambitious undertaking for anyone, but especially if it's a first-time political endeavor running for office. What made you decide to jump in, and why should Idaho elect someone without any political experience at this level?
I think the great difference between my opponent and myself is that I've been in touch with the people constantly the last 15 years advocating for for what they need. And that has been on the state level, and it has been on a national level. Now I've been advocating for all those issues, bringing it all the way to Washington, D.C., and all I found was a lack of willingness. So I think it's time for me to step in and be sitting in the right place and taking the right decisions that should have been taken a long time ago. I think it's time for us to have a representation that really will do something. We cannot have the same representation and expect different results. I think we have plenty of the representation that we have right now in Idaho, and Idaho needs a new leader.
Let me ask you specifically about those ways that you've been in touch with people. Tell us a little bit more about what it is that you've been doing, where you've been advocating, where you've been serving.
Sure. So I was with ICAN, Idaho Community Action Network. It's a nonprofit organization that helps on all different kind of human rights and issues that society needs. When I became a vice president of ICAN, I decided to merge forces with another organization called Alliance for Justice. At that point, we decided to move our forces on the national level. I was able to have opportunity to bring issues over in Florida with the labor, healthcare over in Oregon, immigration all the way to Washington, D.C. And that was a great opportunity because that's when you really leave the issues that people face on the regular basis. So that I think that's an incredible opportunity.
All right, let's start with the questions this evening, and Ruth Brown has our second question. Ruth is from the Idaho Statesman.
Mr. Fulcher, Idahoans will vote next month on Medicaid expansion. The Associated Press found recently that every state that did not expand Medicaid allocated at least 60%, nearly 60% of their federal funding meant to combat the opioid crisis for treatment rather than prevention. Do you support Medicaid expansion that's on the ballot, and why or why not?
Well, thanks for starting with an easy one.
Yeah, you bet.
First of all, on Medicaid expansion, this is, I'm not going to have any more say on this than you or any other voting citizen will be. This is on the ballot, and this is not specifically, that particular issue is not specifically congressionally related. But first of all, I have always struggled with sending taxpayer money to Planned Parenthood and mandatory abortifacients, and that's part of this deal. So I do not support Proposition 2. The other thing it does is health care needs to be affordable and accessible. By expanding Medicaid, that restricts the accessible part because health care providers know they're going to be getting a reduced amount and they're going to be limited on their services they can offer. And by default, that'll turn into rationing. We can do better. There are some private solutions that I have that we can do better with.
Mr. Fulcher, can you maybe expand a little bit on that? Yes, I recognize that this is a state issue and it's a state ballot, but should Medicaid expansion not pass, or should the legislature not move forward with the voters' will if it does pass, there are still a significant number of people who fall into this gap of uninsured individuals. So what do you plan to do to...
There was a reason that I jumped in the race in 2014 in the governor's race, and this was a big part of it. It had to do with the mandatory Obamacare the state was getting thrust into. I felt then that there was alternatives that needed to be put in place. I believe that the circumstances since then have validated my positions at that time. But the bottom line is, and it's not simple and it's not quick, but the combination of competition, transparency, insurance across state lines, healthcare savings accounts, private clinics, healthcare memberships, charity care, wellness, primary care, and a focus on that. Those are the types of things that will drive down costs and do the two magical things that need to happen to improve healthcare and make it affordable and accessible, The government, having me or somebody like me determine where that care goes and what those those rations are is not best. The experts in that field, the private industry, needs to be allowed to compete.
Ms. McNeil, you've been a supporter of Medicaid expansion. You've talked openly about it. The states that have expanded Medicaid have seen record numbers of people signing up. Is Idaho prepared to deal with that?
First, yeah, and thank you for recognizing that I've been actually advocating. I was one of those members that advocated in 2013 when I had my opponent rushing to increase the signatures requirement ballot for the initiative. And so, yes, it's been a tremendous opportunity for the people that have the flexibility. 20 million people had been coverage under ACA. And it's important to recognize that this is something that is not necessarily coming out of a budget that we don't have. This is money that you already pay. This is something that you already pay with your salary on the regular basis. This is federal money collaborating with the state, and it has been for a long time in different states. It has been proved that people can be covered and does not require an extra cost.
If I may on that, Ruth, the federal government has promised for a period of time that they would bankroll a portion of this. Keep in mind, they're $21 trillion in debt, and as we all know, they've got a history of a bait and switch. And so they'll offer dollars to states, and then the next thing you know, those dollars dissipate, and it's up to the state legislature to go find the money to fuel it. It's not that this isn't a compassionate thing to do. The bottom line is we can do better. We can do much better than having the government taking a broken system and expand it. We can put systems in place to improve it, to really impact people's lives positively.
You argued that the state legislature, that it's up to them to find that funding. They've been unsuccessful with that. You know that. You were a state senator.
Well, you missed the point. The point is the state legislature decided not to expand Medicaid, and because they knew the ramifications of it. They know what happens when government is making your health care decisions. You're the best person to make those health care decisions, not the legislature, me, or Congress. We need to give you a system where you can do that and make things more accessible and affordable.
You know, if I might, just for a few seconds, I truly believe that it's been tremendously misled, this type of information, specifically from my opponent, that again, had the opportunity for 10 years to do something about it, and he hasn't. And now to come up and say that this is lack of money or there is no funds for it or we have a tremendous deficit in all these areas is completely misled. And I do want to make sure, because it is on the voter's guide that was mentioned about affecting your education budget and that affecting the roads and that affecting to other sources that we already had budget for. So I want to make sure that people get into the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy and review and understand that it has nothing to do with any of the deficit that my opponent is talking about.
There's some good news, by the way, and that's within the last 48 hours. If I understand correctly, the pharmaceutical companies will have the ability, or Medicare in particular will have the ability to negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies. If I understand that directly, that should have a very significant impact on reducing the cost of those pharmaceuticals.
Mark, let's move along to you and another very important issue facing Congress and facing all of us right now.
And we're talking immigration, something you both know a lot about. Continues to be one of Congress's biggest debates, and for many, one of our most frustrating failures. Outgoing Representative Raul Labrador, an immigration attorney by trade, ran on immigration reform. He spent much of his time in Washington on the issue and told me on a Viewpoint program on Channel 7 in 2016 that it was time to scrap it and start all over after he had worked on it for 5 years to no progress. Ms. McNeil, you immigrated from Mexico City in 1995. Through your experience, you claim the public has been, in your words, misinformed about the process. How so? And if elected, what would you do that no one before you had been able to do on immigration?
It's important to understand that we do have a broken system. That's something that didn't happen yesterday or 2 years ago. It's been there for a long time. It actually happened since 1995 when I was on the process. Of course, my dad was born and raised here. He was an American, so it was a different process. It's a very complex process when it comes to a permanent resident, temporary resident, H-2A visas, H-2B visas. I mean, it's a very complex process, but shouldn't be that complex. We were so close. I was one of the people that advocated, and I sit down right in front of Raul Labrador, and he constantly said that he was going to contribute and nothing happened. Now, this is the issue that we have right now because we are about to have the same representation procrastinating something that should be resolved a long time ago. We need an immigration reform and a path to citizenship. There's about 40 years plus that we've been with this issue in such a long time. And this is immigrants that have contributed to the economy. This is immigrants that have the power to bring the economy up as they have. And it's important to make sure that we keep in mind that we do not need, and we should avoid separation of families. This is a basic value that we have to take in consideration, and I really hope that we have the opportunity to have, with my, if I unlock, you know, I'm humbled to be your congresswoman, to bring to the table this issue, because this is something that obviously right now, as we speak, is happening, and we need to find a solution. Immigration reform, path to citizenship.
But Ms. McNeil, and we're going to let Mr. Fulcher respond to your allegations here in a second, but I'm hearing what you're saying, but I'm not hearing any specifics. What would you do specifically to move the needle on immigration when no one's been able to do it?
I think the most important part, number one, is to make sure that we protect our industry. In the state of Idaho, we have a tremendous industry on the agricultural, dairy, cattlemen industry, manufacturing, construction, and they are very worried about being lack of workforce. And it's important to protect our workforce because that's how we developed in so many different areas, not only in Idaho, but nationwide. So I would suggest to start with temporary permit to work legally in the United States. This will be the first step. I'm willing to find common grounds and common solutions to do one step at a time, but we do need to take these people out of the darkness. This is time for them to be able, they already pay taxes, they already contribute. Let's give them a temporary permit at least, and give them the opportunity to show the people that they are good citizens and they can prove the economy the way they have.
And with those temporary permits, would that give them an opportunity to jump to the front of the line and eventually a path to citizenship through those permits?
You know, it's very interesting when you say on front of the line. There is no line right now. There is no line right now, Mark. And it really is like that. It's so complex. I give you a quick example. We are citizens through my father. My sister came to the United States with everything that she needed to. Right in front of the airport, they told her that she couldn't get in. She had absolutely everything, all the paperwork ready to go, because the officer didn't feel like let her in, and not only that, threatened her to quit to her rights and turn around. So the right hand is not talking to the left hand. We need efficient people to be able to control what exactly is happening. There is no line. The process is so complex that it has created a tremendous, tremendous conflict and confusion, not only with the citizens, but the system itself.
Mr. Fulcher,
So,
lots to unpack.
Mark, first of all, I want to compliment my opponent because my understanding is you went through that process, and that's exactly what you're supposed to do, and you followed the law. And I thank you for doing that. There's three things that I look at with this issue, and it is complex and it is difficult. But the first and foremost is we do need to secure the border. Our job. My job is Homeland Security to a large extent. We've got to know our borders. I was in 47 countries in the business world, and I can promise you other countries secure their borders. Second thing we need to do is we need to get rid of the chain migration component, the visa lottery component, and put a more fair system in place based on merit. Yes, it's true that America has more immigrants than any other nation in the world, somewhere around 1 million a year, but it definitely needs to be better, and we need to have a better control, make it more fair. The seasonal worker component, there is a bill, my understanding, it's the H-2C visa That's, I think Chairman Goodlatte has got that on the table. That would help with the seasonal workers in that circumstance. But at the end of the day, we do have a rule of law. And by the way, I think there's some other things that can be done. When my opponent went through this process, it was probably very, very difficult and costly. I think there are some things we can do to make that more available and perhaps streamline the costs and encourage people to follow the law. But we need to follow the law. You
mentioned securing the borders. Does that mean you support using public funds for the wall?
Yes. Whether it's a actual hard physical wall or some variation thereof, there might be certain areas where it's simply not practical for that or necessary. But yes, I do. And I think that the return on that in terms of safety and improvement on the efficiency of the system will more than pay for that over the course of time.
May I? You know, it's really interesting that my opponent, and I appreciate the compliment, but actually it's a very complex process. My sister that lives in Italy, which she decided to stay in Europe, applied in 2003, and we are in 2018. We're still waiting. This is what's happening. And I don't think the agricultural industry, and I don't think the dairy and cattlemen industry can wait that long. We need solutions right now. We need solutions today. They had the opportunity for a long time, like I said, it's been a long time having the same representation and blocking any and every possibility to have a better immigration system. So, and that is just on that end. And in regards to having he mentioned about investing with the taxpayers for the wall. I find extremely ironic and sad that we as U.S. citizens advocate in 1987 when we had Reagan talking to Gorbachev about tearing the wall down. And here we are asking for a wall. And it's a common sense. This is the values. This is what we are. We are the people that have been advocating to the world about kindness, about being brother, and about being humane. And this is what we have right now, so I'm extremely sad that my opponent decides to support it, but of course this is the difference between here and I.
Mark, if I may, I think there's very poor comparison with the East-West Berlin scenario and a country that is simply fulfilling its constitutional obligation to secure a border. That's a very, very poor comparison, in my opinion. In the short term, I think that, at least for Idaho, and to address what my opponent mentioned, the H2C goes a long way on that front. And then after that, then we work on that merit system to make it fair for everyone. And also keep in mind that our first loyalty is to our American citizens now. And I don't ever want to turn my back on them. That doesn't mean we don't want more people coming in, but if you want to become an Idahoan, if you want to become American, that's fine. Follow the law.
Ms. McNeil, I'd like to just follow up and ask you about the caravan that is moving its way through Mexico right now and expected to be on our border here within weeks. What do you think should be done in that situation? Should we allow those people into the country?
I think at number one, I will, and I strongly hoping that they don't separate families. That is a value that every American have shared. I traveled from the north to the south, from the left side, from the right side, and they were extremely sad to know that we have a new administration where they are okay separating families.
Well, I think they've walked back on that, but also those families that are moving through Mexico now have been warned not to come with their families, but yet they're still coming. So what should we do when they arrive at the border?
I think that will be a decision that we have a humanitarian crisis, number one. We have to recognize that. We have a humanitarian crisis not all over around the world. This is the years that we have more immigration moving from one place to another, and there is a lot of political and situations, the crisis in different countries, and that obviously that's the reason.
And I recognize that, but what should we do if that is the situation we face here in a few weeks?
Well, I think in my point of view, will be to have some aid humanitarian. That's number one. This is
letting them into the country and providing humanitarian
aid? That will be
aid?
something that I'm hoping that the new administration takes charge in a very humane way.
Mr. Fulcher?
I think that's a really important point. And my understanding when these crises occur is oftentimes, unfortunately, people use children for leverage. And I've never liked that, no matter what the circumstances are. Of course, no one, certainly myself included, would ever want to separate families.
Were you dismayed when you learned that that's what was happening?
I was
as
dismayed when I learned that in so many cases, those children were being used as tools for immigration purposes, and that's just not right.
But what about the separation that did take place under the Trump administration?
Of course, and those are always concerns that we want to try to deal with. But the other thing is worth noting on this. I find it interesting that so many people want to come to America, and that's great. But at the same time, the opposition that I will face, should I prevail next Tuesday, is largely encouraging disbanding some of those principles that made America great. Why is it that America is such a place that people want to come to? And so for me, it's focusing on let's empower that America with those foundational principles so that it continues to be the place people want to come. And but I disagree with separating families.
We're only on question number 3, and I would like to move along, but if you'd like to get a quick other word in, but then I would like to go to another question.
Yes, and I appreciate that. I'm just really surprised that my opponent that has been traveling all over around the world cannot recognize the humanitarian crisis that we had. And yes, we do have to protect our country. It's a matter of national security, and we do have all the forces necessarily in the infrastructure to do that. But we're talking about humanitarian crisis, and I feel extremely hurt by seeing what's happening right now. And I know that it's not a simple solution, but I'm really hoping that the new administration really take in consideration not to make the same mistake that they did.
The best thing we can do, Dee, is to make sure that we try to create an environment so that the people who are trying to immigrate have opportunities where they live, and long-term try to export some of those principles, some of those values, some of those ingredients that has made America the place of a destination. And that's real compassion. And of course, we want to try to help these people in these crises. But at the end of the day, long-term, our policy needs to try to fix this solution at its root.
Let's move over to Joe and another area of concern.
Thanks, Steve. Well, a long-standing debate here in the state of Idaho is over the management of public lands. Over 63% of Idaho is public lands. Those are popular spots for camping, for fishing, for a lot of different things. Hunting, it's a beautiful place to live here in Idaho. But how do you feel about the idea that many have talked about over the years, having the state of Idaho take over public lands for management? Mr. Fulcher, we'll start with you.
Big issue for me, has been for a long time. Whoever controls your resources controls your destiny. I mean, that's just how it works. Right now, in many ways, the citizens of Idaho, because of just what you said, are tenants instead of landlords. And so I spent a fair amount of time focusing on this. And I don't think ownership transfer is something that needs to happen, but wise management does. In a given year, we'll have 500,000 acres burn due to wildfire, almost entirely on federal land because it's not managed well. It's diseased. It just simply hasn't been taken care of. And that's bad for the environment. We kick carbon up into the atmosphere. We decimate elk and deer herds and wildlife. And we take away livelihood from people that typically would be cleaning that up. And so it's a lose-lose scenario. And then we spend triple-digit millions on fire suppression. So that's just one example. But the good news there is I think that's changing. And what I would advocate is getting all stakeholders at the table and putting a plan together that's strictly wise. And I do mean wise management. We have to protect the access, not allow it to be sold off. And it's another big challenge, but it's important. We should do that.
Ms. McNeil?
You know, it's really interesting because I'm listening to my opponent, and he's, had amazing ideas, but ideas are only ideas. We need to put our feet on the ground. We have about $2.2 billion that just needs to be in the next 10 years, just for the roads itself, just for the roads itself, for the next 10 years, we need to have a budget just to repair the roads in the state of Idaho. Now, what makes us believe, and this is just a little piece of the puzzle, without things that we need to work on. Now, what makes us believe that we have the capacity to earn any federal land? We don't have the structure, we don't have the capacity, we are so behind in our budget. We have people like my opponent, 10 years, that haven't worked in budgets that they should be working a long time ago, and on top of that, they are like they're in a free candy store and they can go ahead and ask for land when we do not have the capacity to do so. I think it's time to be more realistic. The first fire that we can see in Idaho that we're not capable to fight, and then we're going to face serious situations. We're talking about fiscal responsibilities. We cannot earn something that we don't have the capacity to manage.
So, Joe, of course, there's a very obvious response to that. The real struggle is the current managing entity is $21 trillion in debt. They don't have the resources to manage it, so they don't. And it's within our borders, and so we're left with struggling with that ground that's just simply not managed. And so, and my opponent just mentioned that we can't afford to do it. I would argue we can't afford not to. There's an incredible resource under our feet, and we've got a very low per capita income here. And in many ways, we're starving to death in a room full of food. And it's by wisely taking care of it, we solve so many of those problems. And I don't care what anyone says, those who are local, those who are closest to it, know it the best, they care for it the most. I will bet on Idahoans any day over a Washington bureaucrat to put some wisdom into the management of our precious resources.
Well, relating to that, or did you want to follow up, Ms. McNeil?
Just really quick, because when I've been traveling to the north and to the south, especially in Congressional District number 1, that has been the main reason that people are so concerned that they're taking the lands away from them. So we're talking about people that are so attached to this land. This is exactly the main reason why they're fighting not to take them away from their hands.
And if I may, that is my fear as well, only it's not the state doing it, it's the federal government doing it. Remember, $21 trillion in debt. If you take the viewpoint of President Trump, who is a very successful business guy, he sees the world as either a cost center or a profit center. And with all these lands out there, if there was ever a time at risk of someone selling it off, it's not the locals, it's not the state, it's the federal government. We need to act on this to protect it, to keep it public, to keep the access open, to improve the access. So we just have a very different viewpoint on this issue.
Public space is very important to a lot of Idahoans, and there's an issue that's cropped up recently. Our Morgan Boyson has been following this. A pair of Texas billionaires, the Wilkes family, they have been buying up a lot of private land in southwest Idaho, and at least in one case, they've actually put a gate on a Forest Service road that could potentially block access to public land. In specifically this situation, do you think there should be things in place to prevent private landowners from preventing Idahoans access to public lands? Ms. McNeil, we'll start with you.
Definitely, that is the reason again why I'm so against to take lands from the federal government, because this is the type of issues that we're going to face, and this is just the beginning. Now imagine when we start having, the thousands on acres, we're going to lose control, because we don't have the capacity to even manage that tremendous opportunity that my opponent is talking about.
We've got more capacity than the federal government, but to your point and to your question, I also struggle with blocking access to public lands. I mean, if I'm a strong proponent of owner property rights, and if it's on their particular land and that's deeded and they own it, then they have rights to close that off or whatever. But if they're blocking access to public lands, I've got a problem with that, and that should not happen.
Well, specifically, how would you address that?
But I am not positive on this, but I think if they're blocking a National Forest Service road, I think there's probably laws in place already to eliminate that issue. And if not, we'll put one there.
Well, there also are situations where you could be blocking public land, and there are still ways to access it, but you'd have to drive all the way around an area. You might have to drive out of state to come back to just get to public land. Do you think there should be laws in place or practices in place to prevent that, the hassle that some Idahoans would have to go through just to get to public land?
Practical access. I mean, and that's where I think the common sense comes in. Practical access, and Forest Service roads are access that the public should be able to use. And so I think that we could come up with some common sense solutions on that front. And but it's a massive issue, one that I hope to be able to engage with on firsthand.
Ms. McNeil?
I think number one, public land should stay in public hands so we avoid these type of issues. Again, the most important is to make sure that we continue. This is the heritage of our children. This is the families that go and spend time in the mountains and enjoy the rivers and have this. This is what the Idahoans been looking for generations, and now we're going to try to take it away from them. This is when I bring the real value of what I call.
Certainly, I'm not talking about taking away. I'm just the reverse. I'm trying to figure out ways to keep it open. And so, if I misunderstood or if I misspoke, I apologize. That certainly was not my intent.
All right, let's move over to Ruth Brown from the Idaho Statesman.
We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about Snake River dams. A federal judge in Washington has ordered the EPA this week to protect the Columbia Basin salmon and steelhead. Warmer water temperatures have led to fewer fish making it upstream. Authorities continue to question whether we need the 4 lower Snake River dams. Do you support breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams, and why or why not? Ms. McNeil, we'll start with you.
When I was learning on regards to the dams, we know that this is a core issue and it's happening right now. We will have to let the federal court to decide on regards what is going to happen, because there is obviously an environment impact. Now it's been already 2 years. That is something that couldn't be resolved. And I felt that there was a little bit of negligence on their side not to come up with specifics. I think there's different ways that we can generate hydroelectric without having to impact the environment. And I feel really sad that we have the state of Idaho being in dispute on this specific issue. This is something that should have been done a long time ago. So in my point of view, I think I know this is a big project. It will require all kind of obviously specific people that know exactly what they're doing, but we will have to take an action. Again, we will have to leave this to the courts at this point.
So the question was, do you support breaching the 4 lower dams?
I think I will have to take a little bit more interest on regards to what exactly it's the foundation of the problem.
Mr. Fulcher.
So Ruth, one of the things that my family and the people of this congressional district, I think, have developed over the course of time is a propensity to like to use electricity and to eat food, and so much of that, so much of the purpose of those dams is to allow irrigation to flow to our farms, and fuel that economic engine in the state of Idaho, and create the electricity for these lights to be on at a cost that is low and environmentally friendly. And so I do not support breaching those dams. Does that mean we can't put extra effort into trying to figure out how to make that more amenable to the fish population? Of course. But if given the option of the fish population or the human population, I'm going to side with the human population. But honestly, I think we can do both. But the answer is not breaching the dams.
Let's move along to Mark and the next question.
The debate over climate change as human cause continues in many circles, as you both know, as wildfires and major catastrophic weather events around the nation and the globe continue to get larger and more deadly. Where do you stand on climate change as a human-caused issue? And we'll start with you, Ms. McNeil.
Well, climate change, whether people believe it or not, is a fact, and it's happening. And I feel extremely sad that the budget for the APA has been reduced. I'm also extremely sad that over 70 rules will be reversed in regards to the Environmental Protection Agency. So we have to take in consideration, number one, to maintain those regulations. This is not only for the environment itself, the APA, but it also has to do with the water that you drink, with the food that you eat, and obviously the impact that causes in the environment. It's a fact, it's a reality, so I'm really hoping, number one, that we protect the regulations that we already have in place, that have been working well, and that we do not cut the budget on the APA more than what already is.
Okay, so you're advocating protecting the EPA regulations that we have right now.
Correct.
And then your second thing was what?
And it was obviously talking, number one, for the regulations,
Right.
and then number two, to make sure that we don't cut the budget.
Okay.
I mean, it has been cutting the budget in the APA, and obviously that will create an impact, pretty much obviously in a national level.
Sure, Mr.
Yeah.
Fulcher.
So clearly, we've seen some change in recent years, and I find it interesting that it used to be called global warming. It's not global warming anymore. It's called climate change, and this actually links back, at least in part, to the previous discussion point, because what's one of the largest so-called components of that, that's carbon emissions. Where it's the largest source of carbon emissions, at least in our state, it's wildfires. And so once again, if we were really wise about how we were managing that wonderful resource, that would have an impact. I was reading some information on this that kind of told a story to me, Mark, and it dates back to the early 1980s, and there were people that were coming together and bringing this issue up, saying that we had 10 years to act on this, or basically in some fashion dramatic, horrible things were going to happen. Once again, in the Al Gore years, that was an issue that he championed, and we had 10 years. And from what I can tell, we've had about 4 cycles of 10 years where if we didn't act with something dramatic, there was going to be huge ramifications. I think the things that we can do is in terms of energy, we've got a lot of work at the National Lab that is the portable nuclear energy solutions that would potentially have a very positive impact on that front. Of course, we've got gas, wind, solar, those environmentally friendly things that would help on this front. But if you take a look at a millennia back, this is a cycle. If you take a look at 50 years back, then there's a trend. And so I don't propose that we tax our people as much as people say is going to need in order to try to fight something that we're not sure of as a natural cycle or not. And so I am not in support of adding regulations or adding costs for this.
And so no carbon tax for you?
No.
Okay. Ms. McNeil, would you support a carbon tax based on footprints?
I don't think we necessarily need to increase or ask our taxpayers to put any extra money in it. I mean, the money's already been there. We're talking about fiscal responsibility. We have about $32.5 billion in the budget for the hydroelectric projects. And I don't think we necessarily need to increase any tax in regards to that. We just need to have an opportunity to manage and create better opportunities to have the hydroelectric projects or the wind turbine or any other way to create energy. But I don't see, having to increase any tax to our taxpayers.
Okay, thank you.
Joe.
The big conversation nationally has been gun violence and school safety. And as a member of Congress, you'd be faced with a lot of questions based on this topic. And here in Idaho, the state actually has recently been giving federal grants to help improve school safety. Most recently, a federal grant for more than $500,000 to set up a tip line, a school safety tip line. Now, in part of school safety and gun control, at this point, how do you address gun violence in America? Is there a problem with the guns? Is there a problem with mental health? And alternatively, and we've talked about how the federal budget that's at a high deficit, so spending more money is important for things that are very important. how exactly would you like to see the federal government helping states and public schools protect their students? Ms. McNeil.
And there is a mental issue right now. We have, I believe, is about 40% of the people that get suicide in the state of Idaho possess guns. This is really sad, and this is dangerous. So we have to make sure that when we have gun owners, which, obviously this is a part of our Second Amendment, which I protect and defend, but we have to look into what the mental issue that have people that possess guns. It will be a really great opportunity for us to improve in that area and bring mental treatment to people and not victimize them. They usually get the first service on the mental evaluation when they're already in prison. And a lot of them are not necessarily people that are criminals. This is people that have mental issues. So we need to create an opportunity to have resources to evaluate people that do possess guns. And I know it's a very complex issue, but there is a mental situation like that right there, and also the security on our community and with our children in the schools, in the hospitals, in a movie theater, in the supermarket, God knows. I even had it myself when one time I got in the stoplight and I got jumped out of the car with a gun. That happened just right here in Boise, and it had happened several times to several people. This is dangerous. We have to protect our community. We have to protect our people. Obviously protecting our rights, which is obviously the Second Amendment.
Mr. Fulcher.
Yeah, so violence is violence, and whether it's a gun or it's a knife or it's a car or it's a truck or whatever, the issue that unfortunately we're struggling with, I do think has got mental health ramifications. And if you follow what's gone on in Western Europe, where where gun ownership is much more restricted, they still have these crazy deaths, and it's people in most cases driving into crowds with vehicles and that type of thing. It's just as sick. And so I do agree that there's a mental health component, and there's a few ways that at least we should try to look at this. And by the way, government's not the solution on everything. Our families need to be employed here. We need to encourage strong families and strong family relationships. I do think that we need to provide resources to help harden the schools. That's just a fact. I think that needs to happen. The other thing that I would say on that front is, in the legislature, we struggle with mental health because it's hard to define. How do you put a hard definition on it? How do you write code that says this is not right and this is? And then who makes that judgment? That's one thing. And then there are mechanisms. It's not that it can't be done, but it's not simple. We do need to put some focus on that. There's one of the things that I had put on the table that might be an option at some point as we continue to grow economically, use some of those surplus dollars as we have them. That's at the state level. To help provide mental health services, and potentially a component of the catastrophic fund, which is already there, not a new tax. But yes, it's a family issue, it's a mental health issue, and tough one at that for those reasons.
All right, I'd like if
just really quick, I do want to mention there was a time when my opponent was in the legislation and they tried to pass the bullying law, and he voted against it, and that is a great start. If we're talking about a state level, that is a great start with the bullying law, which allows to the parents to notify immediately when a kid has been bullied, when there is abuse between children, because this is what we're seeing in the schools right now. So I think a good opportunity to create some sort of solution at national level, not only state level, will be to create some bullying laws.
So Joe, if I may, we actually, if I recall correctly, we did take action on that. What could be being referred to is a law or a proposed law that was labeled that really wasn't. It was geared much more to other issues, and so in all respect, I think we have taken some action on that. But I do agree that's a source of problem.
Mr. Fulcher, we live in deeply partisan times, and as you know, Congressional District 1 is traditionally conservative, but if you are elected to Congress, you would be representing citizens with many with your viewpoint, but some with a drastically different viewpoint. As Congressman, would you consider it a priority to heal some of the division and reach out to those on the other side of issues? Or is this a time when it is important to stand your ground and dig in for conservative Republican values at all costs?
Oh, my responsibility is to represent everyone. And if there's a certain minority, you represent the minority too, but you always have to take into consideration the ramifications on the majority. And so therein lies the struggle. And that's really what government is. It is a struggle to try to identify right and wrong, and in that gray area, try to find that balance where you're doing the best for the most number of people, and you're staying within the constitutional guidelines that we were granted. And so I take that very seriously. I do think I had good success at that at the state level, and I hope to be able to take that same experience and those skill sets and try to have a positive impact at the national level.
Ms. McNeil, you mentioned common ground, finding common ground, and even tonight as we've been having this conversation, that can be hard to find in these deeply partisan times that I just mentioned. How about for you and the priorities that you would have in terms of representing all Idahoans, even though you have views that would differ significantly from others?
I had a great opportunity to travel through the whole Congressional District number 1, and I did find common grounds. From the left and from the right, we found common grounds on healthcare. We found common grounds on better wages. We find common grounds on education. So those are the things, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're from the left, it doesn't matter if you're from the right. It's about what do you need. So I can provide the tools so you can provide to your family, so you can provide to your company, so you can make sure that you are successful and productive. So yes, I did find common grounds, and I will continue doing so.
So Dee, if I may on that very briefly, this is the first time this evening that my opponent and I have actually met personally. And so I was trying to learn just a little bit about her and looked at her website. We do have some common ground. And I'll tell you right, at least where I think it is on some prison reform components. So there are areas, I think, no matter who you are, where you can find that common ground, and that's something that again, I had some success with and hope to proliferate that nationally.
One of the things that really highlighted the deep divide in our country recently was the confirmation process for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. So I'd like to just ask you to share, what were your thoughts? Ms. McNeil, I'll start with you. What were your thoughts as you saw that process unfold, and what came out of that in terms of seeing our country so divided?
I think it's important to recognize that there was a process to be able to hear Dr. Ford, but I don't think it went deeply. I think it should have stayed a little bit more extensive. We're talking about women that has been traumatized, and she's not by herself. There is millions of women that have been through the same problem. It's so important to make sure that we heard the voice of those that are suffering, and also obviously to hear the ones that have been accused. But it should be a longer and deeper investigation before was nominated. That's my point of view, because we do have a fair and equal opportunity for all of us, and when we briefly cut the edges for such an important situation, I felt that we needed to extend a little bit longer. So I was a little bit
you think more
disappointed.
time would have led to a consensus in our country?
I think it would be a good opportunity for people to understand that they did what they could, that there was no rush, that they took the time necessary, that needed in order to hear both sides, but not to rush in such a way that both sides felt that it was too short and too fast.
Dee, I was actually in Washington, D.C. during those hearings. And I think where we see the emotion and where we see this issue come to a head is when two major issues collide. On one hand is sexual assault, and on the other hand is due process. And my goodness, the sexual assault component, that is very serious. And if there's positive things that came out of that, it was that the level of seriousness of that was brought to light, at least to some extent, and that's important because that's just a major issue. At the same time, there's a due process deal that came together where there was an individual who was by many being considered guilty until proven innocent, and so therein lies, at least in my opinion and my observation, what brought that to a head. And my opponent mentions more time. There was either 6 or 7 federal investigations on this where the information just did not collaborate. And so I think that the process, ugly as it was, did work out. And but it also brought to light a real serious issue that we need to know about and address.
Thank you both. I want to give you time to have closing statements, so if you'd like to continue this, Ms. McNeil, in your closing statement, then I would encourage you to do that, but I want to be sure that you both have time now, and so we'll start, and Ms. McNeil, you have the first opportunity for your closing statement.
Thank you, everyone here and viewers that spend this evening watching us. Idahoans have a decision to make about who will replace Raul Labrador. Idahoans are the ones who make that decision, not wealthy out-of-state donors seeking influence in Congress. I will represent Idaho's agenda for working people. I will work with members of Congress across the country and across the aisle. I get it. I will find partners in Congress, find common ground to move forward. We need action. I am a freedom-loving, hard-working businesswoman. I work for the people's interest, Idaho's people. I am Cristina McNeil, and I ask for your vote on November 6th. Idaho's future is in your vote.
Thank you so much. Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you again to KTVB and to my opponent for being here and participating. Friends, there is a reason that I have the support of Idaho's entire congressional delegation, all of the state constitutional officers, the entire majority leadership of the United States Congress, and the Idaho legislature. Virtually all of the major pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, and family-oriented organizations, and many others. That's because with your help, I've actually had the opportunity to do something, playing a major role with tax cuts and passing pro-life, Second Amendment school change legislation. With me, you know exactly what you're going to get. An Idahoan with global and legislative experience, and an optimist able to work across the political aisle. This is an exciting time of history, and I believe that there's an opportunity to work some real positive change. We can make things better, and if you hire me, I will be your champion in Congress. I'm Russ Fulcher. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. The hour flew by for us. I so appreciate your participation tonight. Also, my colleagues, Mark Johnson, Joe Paris, Ruth Brown, and Danielle Alsop. It's been a pleasure to be engaged in this evening. And we thank you. We're not done. We still have more debates here on KTVB, so let me give you the rundown on Monday. The candidates for Superintendent of Public Instruction will be here. Democrat Cindy Wilson and current Superintendent Sherri Ybarra will engage in an hour-long debate starting at 4 p.m. And then also on Monday at 5:30 evening, the candidates for governor will square off. Paulette Jordan and Lieutenant Governor Brad Little will be here at the Brandt Center. That debate is scheduled to last 90 minutes, so we're expecting to really be able to delve into a lot of issues on that debate on Monday. And we want to remind you that Election Day, as the candidates have mentioned, it is coming up very quickly. It's November 6th. And want to make sure that you're informed ahead of Election Day. We have a voter guide available for you at ktvb.com and the KTVB app. So remember to check that out. And of course, we're so glad that you could be with us. We thank NNU once again for inviting us and allowing us to produce our debate here on the campus of Northwest Nazarene University in Nampa. And good night.